Mislimo, da bomo šli skozi življenje, ne da bi naleteli na nadnaravno, razen v filmih. Toda v tisti vasi sem doživela nekaj, ob čemer mi je zaledenela kri v žilah.
Rekli so mi, da to stvari ljudje izginejo. Vendar nič res ne odide. To sem zdaj čutila kot prisotnost na svojem hrbtu.
Kaj je meja, če slovarske definicije ne držijo? Meja je nekaj, kar nosite v sebi, ne da bi se tega zavedali, dokler ne pridete na kraj, kakršen je ta. Kličete v brezno, kjer je na eni strani sonce, na drugi tema, in odmev pomnoži vašo željo, popači vaš glas in ga ponese v daljno deželo, v kateri ste morda nekoč že bili.
Večer, ta film študentov AGRFT v Ljubljani nas je tako lepo uvedel v ta dogodek in kljub temu, da to kislo vreme, ta čuden dan, kar kliče po ednini ali pa da bi podolživljali našo lepo dvojino sami doma, je vas lepo videti v tako lepem številu, da bomo danes skupaj delili tisto, kar nas druži, naše dobre znanke, učiteljice, ne vem, kaj vse so knjige za vas, včasih zatočišče za pik, včasih tudi možnost potovanja, ne da bi se premaknil z hišnega praga ali pa potreboval vizo. In prav to bomo danes počeli. Povabila vas bom na prav posebno potovanje v en neverjeten kraj, lahko rečem, morda en najmanj opisanih delov Evrope. Šli bomo na mejno območje med Bolgarijo, Grčijo in Turčijo, kjer je fizična meja zelo zaznamovala usodo ljudi. Ampak to ne bo pogovor samo o 3 državah in meji, ne, ampak kaj meja pomeni za ljudi, ki tam živijo, kako jo skušajo preživeti in kako so tudi poiskali rešitve. To bo zgodba o meji v glavah, včasih tudi o meji med resničnostjo in tistim intuitivnim. In o tem tako lepo piše naša sogovornica v knjigi, ki jo držim v rokah. Letos je prišla, oziroma je šla pri Beletrini, Meja. Knjiga prevedena v več kot 20 jezikov, prejela je res prestižne literarne nagrade po svetu in zelo sem vesela, da smo vendarle danes malo z zamudo preklicali tudi njeno avtorico. Z nami je Kapka Kassabova. Kapka, hello, good evening.
Hello, dober večer.
Dober večer. It is so good to see you. We were a bit worried.
I'm sorry.
It's good that you're here. Kapka, I was mentioning a little bit in my introduction, we're going to talk about landscapes tonight, which are defining our destiny. We're going to talk about borders, but as well you are, well, a traveler. You have a very interesting background, maybe just as a short introduction, because you were born in Bulgaria, but then moved to New Zealand, and now you live in Scotland.
That's right. I live in the north of Scotland now in an area known as the Highlands. And moving here made me realize that my destiny was always going to be the mountains. Do I carry on, or are we translating?
Yes, we are having the translations here in our earphones, so you just continue. It's a very nice rhythm. Everybody can understand. We can see and hear you very well.
Yes, you mentioned landscapes and geography. I guess geography is how I think about it, about the land. Perhaps not so much landscape, although that too is true, but rather the geography as a destiny and as an embodied life of the land. And I think I always felt that way about places since childhood. Bulgaria has many mountains, and Meja border opens with a scene on a beach, on a Black Sea beach, close to the border with Turkey. And that's the beginning of the journey in the book, because that's also the beginning of my personal story with borders, but also with landscapes. And the seascape, the seascape of the Black Sea quickly becomes a mountainscape as we sort of enter the Stranja Mountains that straddle Bulgaria and Turkey, a border mountain. And I started there on that childhood beach because those were the times when I was closest to the border, but also closest to nature. And those are the times of my childhood that really made me who I am, a kind of geographical being. Anyway, that's the beginning of the journey of the book. We have to have a beginning, don't we?
It's nice that you mentioned nature, because nature really plays a very important part in your book as well. And somehow Scotland, you mentioned the mountains, the highlands, were a bit of an inspiration as well for you, going back to your own country of the childhood, the changes in nature in the Scottish Highlands.
Definitely. I mean, I think that was, you know, I've lived in several countries. I grew up in Bulgaria. I spent my 20s in New Zealand, where I studied, and then I ended up at the age of 30. I ended up in Scotland. All of these are big changes, cultural changes, changes of geography, changes of, you know, my environment. But possibly the most fateful, the most life-changing change was moving from city living to country living. And that happened about 13 years ago when I moved from Edinburgh in Scotland to the Highlands up here in the north of Scotland, because that reconnected me with what I call the wild self. And that's the childhood self. All children are wild, you know, and I think all creative people also have to be a little bit wild, because the imagination is a wild thing. And for me, the imagination has always been linked with a kind of with a geographical journey. And yes, it's ironic that I only really started the journey with border when I moved to the Highlands of Scotland. I guess I needed the confidence to believe that I could survive for a time in a kind of peripheral landscape, or in a even in a kind of mountainous area. And when I was living in a city, I didn't have that confidence. So it's a funny thing. It's almost like all of us, each one of us, you, me, we have, you know, different selves. And I think the wild self is one of those selves. And I think for me, it's a vital self.
We are there. Thank you for this beautiful introduction. I think this is the beginning of our traveling tonight. I'm not alone. I'm surrounded by, well, very different generations of readers. I have guests who are regular guests here at Fabula Festival. I have definitely some curious people, because the book was just published. It was this year, your book, so Meja, Border, in the Slovenian language. And I think it's a nice moment to ask our actress, Maja Glušić, who's with us tonight, to read an extract from your book, because we're already there at the shores of the Black Sea and close to the mountains. Like you said, here we go.
Gora norosti. To se je zgodilo na polovici potovanja. Visoko v Rodopskem gorovju, na grško-bolgarski meji, se je serpentinasta cesta vzpenjala po rečni soteski, in tam, kjer se je cesta končala, je bila poslednja vas pri Kazni z izdolbenimi okni in posušenim kamnitim vodnjakom. V njej ni nihče več živel. Za cesto in vasjo so se na nikogaršnji zemlji razprostirali hrastovi gozdovi. Mislimo, da bomo šli skozi življenje, ne da bi naleteli na nadnaravno, razen v filmih. Toda v tisti vasi sem doživela nekaj, ob čemer mi je zaledenela kri v žilah. Še vedno ne vem, ali je bilo to nekaj resnično, a občutki, ki jih je v meni sprožilo, so še danes v mojem telesu. Na ta pozabljeni del gorovja sem prišla v iskanju nečesa in na koncu naletela na to. Morda je bilo prav to tisto, kar sem iskala. Kakorkoli že, kar naenkrat sem tekla po tej soteski bodikavega gozda, polnega divjih prašičev in skalovja. 20 kilometrov naokrog ni bilo žive duše. Neusmiljeno sonce pa mi je udarjalo v glavo, kot bi me hotelo kaznovati za neki daven zločin. Tam med vrhovi je bila pečina, ki se je zares imenovala Sodba, kraj, s katerega so metali trupla v brezno časa med prvimi obrednimi žrtvovanji Tračanov in zadnjimi leti hladne vojne. Toda sama sem tekla v nasprotno smer, navzdol, do najbližje poseljene vasi, ki je bila daleč stran, kot tudi vse drugo, kar sem si znala razložiti. Občutek, da to nekaj ni osebno, da to ni samo moja groza, se je kasneje potrdil. Ulovila sem frekvence dogodkov, ki jih je v sebi držala gora. To niso bile naravne, temveč mejne frekvence. Frekvence gozda, v katerega so vrezane začetnice tistih, ki so bili v 20. stoletju mladi in obupani. Prišla sem po njihove zgodbe, toda ali sem bila tej nalogi res kos? Rekli so mi, da tu stvari in ljudje izginjajo, vendar nič zares ne odide. To sem zdaj čutila kot prisotnost na svojem hrbtu. Čeprav je odbilo poldne, se je Orfejeva gora pomračila. Prišla sem do rečnega rokava in se ustavila, da bi pila. Ledena voda me je rezala v grlu. Vedela sem, da čez mejo, na najvišjem gorovju balkanskega polotoka, izvira reka Mesta, Nestos, in da njen tok pred izlivom v Egejsko morje meri več kot 234 kilometrov. Toda ali so takšna dejstva že kdaj pomagala komu v stiski? To ni bila običajna reka. Na drugi strani meje je bila prepadna jama z grmečim slapom, imenovana Hudičevo žrelo. Pravijo, da je tam Orfej vstopil v podzemlje. Nič, kar pride v jamo, nikoli ne pride ven, vključno z zadnjima speleologoma, moškim in žensko, ki sta tam izginila v 70 letih prejšnjega stoletja. Tudi Orfeja, edino bitje, ki se je vrnilo iz tega htonskega kraljestva, so na koncu raztrgale besneče menade in njegovo glavo vrgle v reko Marico, ki teče 480 kilometrov, preden se izlije v Egejsko morje. Njegov zločin? Ob koncu življenja je prelomil zavezo zvestobe in prestopil dve nevarni meji. Od svojega davnega mentorja in boga nočnih misterijev Dioniza k bogu sonca Apolonu ter od ljubezni do žensk k ljubezni do moških. Prečkanje meja ni varno niti za bogove, kaj šele za smrtnike. V spodnjem toku sem naletela na žensko in dva moška, ki so na majhen čoln natovarjali kruh, na desetine hlebcev kruha. Imeli so dolge lase in na obrazih se jim je risalo veselje. Moja groza se je razblinila in spremenila v očaranost. Povabili so me, naj z njimi prečkam reko. In tam, na drugi strani, ampak o tem pozneje. Kaj je meja, če slovarske definicije ne držijo? Meja je nekaj, kar nosite v sebi, ne da bi se tega zavedali, dokler ne pridete na kraj, kakršen je ta. Kličete v brezno, kjer je na eni strani sonce, na drugi tema. In odmev pomnoži vašo željo, popači vaš glas in ga ponese v daljno deželo, v kateri ste morda nekoč že bili.
Hvala lepa, Maja. Kapka, how does it sound for you in the Slovenian language?
Beautiful.
And here we are. We went straight to the mountain, straight to the forest. We had a soft start. You described it so beautifully, but we are at the hard border. It was the southernmost border of the Iron Curtain. How do you remember your childhood in this forbidden landscape?
Well, it was a forbidden landscape, so actually nobody went there apart from soldiers. And the local people who happened to live in these border villages. And so I saw these, 30 years later, I saw these places 30 years later when I went there, really to get to know this area, to, I suppose, listen to stories. There's nothing more I love in this world than to be in a place and to listen to the stories of that place, to the memories of that place. And it was a militarized zone, about 20 kilometers each side of the border, and it was the same in Greece and Turkey. Until the early 1990s, really. It's also a very beautiful region, it's mountainous. It has some of the, remotest, I suppose, some of the remotest mountain villages that still have, people left. So soon after arriving there, I understood that this wasn't going to be a single thread, a single narrative thread, or a single line of inquiry. It wasn't just going to be the story of the Iron Curtain, heard through the voices of different generations. It was also going to be stories from the mountain, it was going to be individual stories of people, and almost everyone I met really on this journey, on all three sides of the border, had a story worth telling. For example, the Turkish shepherd who lives in the last village before the border, and it's an empty village, and he and his wife are the last people living there with their sheep, and they live there out of love, out of love for their place and for their animals, and it's a tough life, and it's isolated and harsh. And the refugees who were coming in from Syria at the time would stop at their door and ask, is this Bulgaria? Is this the European Union? Because the human traffickers would drop people off, would dump people at the border, short of taking them across the border. And then Mustafa and his wife would have to face this human suffering, as best as they could. And their story, I thought, was very much a story of the border. They are the last shepherds, of that community.
It's nice that you mention this story exactly. It's one of my favorites as well, and it tells so much about the way you're writing, because Meja is not. It's not a big book about history, right? Sometimes it seems like a folk tale.
Well, I suppose there are,
with all the characters, the way you describe serious things as well, historical facts, but sometimes I can read it like a modern folktale.
Yeah, why not? It's not a folk tale. It's the border people, you know, it's the lives of the border people. And of course there are surprises. You know, I guess one of the reasons why I am drawn to margins and peripheries and is because of the surprises. It's because of the of this gold, this kind of gold of human experience. There are treasure hunters there. They look for literal gold. You know, I look for this other gold. I suppose of some kind of truth, the truth of the border experience. And I realized that I had, you know, people's voices had to speak for themselves, and their lives had to speak for themselves. And I suppose the folk elements, as you say, or I see it more in terms of myth, you know, mythos, really. And I've always been interested in, because I'm a poet, I guess I'm interested in symbols. And myth works through symbol, you know. And so when I came across, for example, the firewalking ritual that is still practiced in Stranja Mountain. This is the mountain on the Black Sea, backs up on the Black Sea. And part of it is in Bulgaria, another part is in Turkey. And some villages in the Bulgarian part still practice this thing called nestinarstvo. In Greek, it's called anastenaria. And it really is an ancient, it is a remnant of an ancient ritual, which is actually much bigger than just walking on embers, but holding icons of Saint Constantine and Saint Helena. It's much more than that. It's actually, you know, a seasonal ritual involved with worship of the sun. So it's an old pagan ritual that was later Christianized, and the only two places in Europe where this is still practiced is in Stranja and in some villages in northern Greece. And I described this because it's interesting, and also because of its symbolic value, because really it has a therapeutic value for the community who practices it. It's a traumatized region, you know, the border region. People are kind of generationally carriers of this trauma. And there is no therapy available. There is no other healing except nature. And I think we are all turning more and more towards nature, you know, for our healing, because we are all unwell, all of us. We are unwell.
It is a traumatized region, like you said, but it's such, you describe it so beautifully, so personally in a way. So something abstract really becomes something concrete in the stories of the people. And borders are a very important topic, not just in this book, but in your work in general. It's basically, Meja is part of a trilogy. So I hope that we will get the other two books translated into Slovenian soon, because they basically speak about that, how borders in the Balkans are traumatic.
Absolutely.
Because they were drawn in wars.
Absolutely. Every border is traumatic. In the Balkans, I suppose it depends. I mean, we can open this up and generalize and say that every political border is, you know, carries a traumatic story. But I think in the Balkans we have more recent experience of trauma, for obvious reasons that we all know. But even along that border, which is the former Iron Curtain, I kind of discovered, I stumbled into stories that I didn't really know about, because there are things you don't really find in the history books, and if you find them, and I think our history books in the Balkans are always very one-sided, you know. It's always the neighbor's fault. I stumbled across stories of migration across this border, which really date back to the Balkan Wars, 1912, 1913, then World War I, World War II, the Greek Civil War, which came after World War II. Of course, the Yugoslav wars, you know, they're sort of that affected the western border of Bulgaria, which is not part of this story in this book, but it is part of the story of my following book, To the Lake, which explores Lake Ohrid and Lake Prespa. Again, a triple border, Macedonia, Greece, and Albania. But we'll put that aside for the moment. So to return to my point, that the stories I stumbled across were incredibly powerful, of families migrating, families being displaced. And I heard this story on all three sides of the border. And it's almost as if it was like in a Greek chorus, you know, like in a tragic Greek chorus, where it's kind of the same story repeating, except in three different languages. So, for example, in the Greek border villages, there are family stories that date back to the displacement of Greeks from Turkey, from Smyrna, the Smyrna catastrophe, as they call it in Greece, and it was a catastrophe. In Turkey, there are the family stories like the one of the photographer Nevzat, who is in the book, and we become friends. And Nevzat's family are Pomaks, so they are Bulgarian Muslims who were displaced during World War I, and they went backwards and forwards across the Bulgarian-Turkish border. It's an epic story. They stayed in Turkey, and Nevzat was actually my guide. He's my age, a bit older. He was my guide in these border villages in Turkey and my translator. And incredible kind of layer upon layer of human experience and human truth, because the level of honesty and, I suppose, authenticity and generosity that I felt I was receiving. I think that's what makes the book so alive, because it's full of people's voices and the deep truth of, you know, of what people have survived. And of course, there are also the stories of the dead, those who didn't survive the border. They are as important, the ghosts of the border. And it's almost as if, you know, in psychology, you have this concept of archetypes, not stereotypes, but archetypes. And Carl Jung, the father of modern psychology, the Swiss psychologist, kind of, I think, wrote at length about archetypes. And sometimes when I was talking to, for example, a border soldier, actually today they're called border police. They used to be border soldiers, used to be the border army, and now it's the border police. It's as if I was talking to all the border soldiers, you know, from that generation, who had witnessed and sometimes committed murder. And so it became almost like an archetypal journey in the underworld, because the border is an underworld. It's Hades, you know? You go down into the border. The way you do when you go down into the contents of the psyche, the subconscious. And it was a bit like a descent into the underworld, this whole journey. not to say it was depressing or dark all the time, but I think border zones are like that. They are like an arena, like an open arena of the collective unconscious. And everything happens out of view, it's hidden. It's not in the capital, It's not in the centers of power. It's not in the mainstream. It's out of view. And yet, at the same time, they are the forefront of history. And people who live in a border region are somehow faced to be like soldiers of this the civilians are forced to become soldiers, and I'm speaking here not just literally, but also psychologically. That's what a militarized zone does. And also that's what buried secrets do, because the border is still full of buried secrets. So the psychology of the border is very interesting. And at the time, I remember when I started being interested in this and traveling there and writing the book, and several people said to me, but borders are no longer interesting because they are becoming a thing of the past. This is a globalized world. Why are you writing about the border? And I didn't even have an answer apart from because I have to. Because I have to. My instinct took me there. And I suppose also my anger and my something from childhood took me back there. I think all of our lives, it's the same for all of us. I think all of our lives contain certain journeys that we must make. It's like a contract almost that we have with ourselves. Certain journeys.
And it gets very personal for you from time to time in the book as well, in the stories. You're very much involved.
Well, yes, I guess I'm not an anthropologist and I can't just be an observer, I become a participant. And I think even an anthropologist can be an observer and a participant. But I think the stories are very personal. The stories that I received, like gifts, they were gifts. And the border is also an emotional place. It's a painful place. It's a sensitive place, even when it's demilitarized. And the geography itself makes it doubly so, because of the mountainous terrain, because of the forests in some of the areas in the book. And there is also magic because these are ancient places. People have lived there for a long time. And I touch a little bit on that. There are remains, fascinating remains from the Thracians, who were perhaps the first known inhabitants, like the Illyrians of the southern Balkans. Not the first known, but the first named. We know their name. That tribe was Thracians and Illyrians to the west. They left traces, they left secrets. But I didn't want to go down that road too much in the book because it isn't a folk story. I was interested in lived experience. And one of the things that changed me, because I was a changed person after this, this book changed me. These encounters with people changed me. It was almost a physical kind of sensation of, I will never be the same after this. One of the surprises, one of the golden kind of truths that I came back with is that we are what we love. you know. And the people in the book, you know, the people whose stories kind of tell us something about the border, also tell us about not just about survival, but about healing, you know, about healing through love, through doing what you love and identifying with what you love. And for a lot of the people there, it's the place, you know. Or for example, Taco, there is this man known as Taco, again on the Turkish side of the border, and he lives on the Black Sea coast. And he, for 30 years, he has been a self-appointed guardian of this Byzantine rock monastery. He's unpaid, and he just sits there because he loves this rock monastery. It isn't really looked after by the state or by any other local authority. He is the only sort of custodian of this rock monastery from, I think, from the 6th century. And it's a kind of labyrinth with it's an amazing place. He identifies with this place that he loves, and he volunteers to do this. And he's one of many people, you know, with stories like that. And I felt humbled, really, because of the devastation of the background, you know, the history of devastation and trauma in this area. It made love and any kind of acts of healing stand out even more.
Mm-hmm.
A bit like the fire walking.
And talking about that and the love and the emotions, I would like to mention women in your books as well. They have a special role. Well, women in the Balkans obviously do, like a contrast to this patriarchic decision making. It's a world made by men, ruled by men. Borders were made by men. And on the other side, you have this women, very emotional. Your grandmother, who is one of the, well, protagonists in your other book you mentioned, To the Lake, right? The Lake Ohrid and her connections to that. So women do really have a special place in your books as well, a special role.
Of course, yeah, more and more. You know, it's funny because as you rightly say, I think borders are almost the symbol of the patriarchy. You know, they are binary, us and them, black and white, good and bad, safe and dangerous. It's a completely it is almost a symbol of the failure of the patriarchy and all its kind of and I suppose the military industrial complex that runs it. And we can see that failure everywhere. So border was, in a strange way, a kind of, you know, because borders are very masculine, not just symbols, they're very masculine places. You know, the border soldiers are always men. So it's kind of that violence, you know, the visible or invisible violence of the border is very male. The next book was very kind of female, you know, To the Lake. And it was all about water as well. And of course, water is a feminine element. We are mostly water, you know, we are born of water. And also water has a memory. And it's funny how in the border region in Meja, these springs, these mountain springs acquire a special meaning because, of course, they are a place of healing and a place of renewal. Every springtime, the spring in the forest opens up again and the water comes out. And in old pagan rituals, obviously water has a special place. And I kind of became really interested in water during the research for Border. And of course, fire is also present in Border because of the fire walkers. Also the symbology in Slavic, in Balkan myth of the fire dragon, who of course is a predecessor of Saint Elijah and all the other Christian and Muslim, deities. So I think I really became interested during this journey in the symbolism of elements and how they relate to the human psyche. And into the lake, that kind of became, part of a kind of epic story. At the same time, an intimate story, of course, because it's very personal. It's about the women in my family and other families around the lakes. And then I really explored the power of water in that book. But it started with Border.
Again, yes, and water is very symbolic in a way because there is no physical border on the water. It's very abstract. In a way, it's like a border in our head. And this is a problem for you as well. Yes, we have to change the borders in our head.
Yes. When I went to Lake Ohrid and Lake Prespa for the next book, I had somehow forgotten that I knew it was 3 countries, 2 lakes, 3 countries. But somehow I was really shocked to come across this border in the water, which doesn't exist, except in our heads. And another expression of this kind of the border disease, the border syndrome. And by the way, to this day, you can't cross Lake Ohrid or Lake Prespa by boat because there are national borders, and that's it. And all the fishermen know it, and the boatmen know it, and it's a shame, and it's completely needless. But borders have a momentum. Wars have a momentum. It's generational. The effect of wars and of borders is generational. We know it, and each generation has to deal with the trauma of the previous generation. It's a cycle that we're trapped in, and I think we're desperately looking for alternatives.
Exactly, and maybe solutions. And let's talk about that after the next extract. I would like to ask Meja to read something else from your book, Meja. Meja, izvoli.
Via Pontica. Na kopnem je bila to nekoč rimska pot, ki je Donavo povezovala z Bosporjem. Na nebu je to še vedno selitvena pot za ptice. Via Pontica je dobila ime po Črnem morju, ki se je nekoč imenovalo Pontus Euxinus, gostoljubno morje. Preden so ga kolonizirali miletski Grki, je bilo poznano kot Pontus Axenus, negostoljubno morje, saj je bila plovba po njem nevarna, na njegovih obalah pa so živeli pirati in barbari, beri ne Grki. Ovidij je preživljal leta izgnanstva na zahodni obali tega morja, kjer se je sredi getov trakijskega plemena barbarov, beri ne Rimljanov, smilil samemu sebi in skladal svoje žalostinke. Tukaj sem priklenjen na breg zamrznjeni Ponta Euxina. Stari so vzdeli ime Aksen mu, negostoljub. Ubogi Ovidij, preveč vzvišen, da bi užival življenje. Od njegovih časov so barbari in civilizacije prihajali in odhajali. Nekateri so ostali, a ena pontska stvar se ni spremenila. Če pridete na jugozahodne plaže Črnega morja, kjer si Bolgarija in Turčija delita nevidno morsko mejo, kjer ladje drsijo med Bosporjem in Odeso, lahko še vedno vidite, kako nebo na septembrski dan pomrači 50.000 štorkelj na poti v Afriko. Toda takrat je bilo še poletje.
Hvala lepa. Kapka, there is a lot of history in your stories because we are in a region where lots of things took place. You mentioned the Trajan, the Roman, lots of history. But how to offer solutions for the people, how to exit this vertigo of history and borders, and how to survive, how to find solutions for the life now and in the future? Do we all need a group therapy in the Balkans?
I'm sure we do. Individual therapy too. We do need healing. We need healing. I mean, sometimes all we can do is somehow try and heal ourselves a little bit so that we don't dump everything that we carry on someone else. Sometimes that's enough. You know, sometimes imagine if we could all somehow work with the shadows that we carry. If we can all go in the underworld a little bit with help. We need help for this. We need support. And face, you know, face what's there. We could have more dignified and more honest lives, with less violence, with less fear. I think fear is really the big issue. And borders are the product of fear. And wars are the product of fear. And I think fear is almost a pandemic now. It's contagious. And we need to keep looking for an antidote to this poison. And the antidote exists. And I'm forever looking for it. The third book in this series, I called it Elixir. And that's an alchemical thing. What is elixir? And I keep going back to this thing about love, actually. Love in its widest sense. That we must become what we love. And love is an antidote to fear. And perhaps it should almost be a daily practice that we have, you know, to focus on something we love. And I keep wanting to write about people who teach me that lesson, the lesson of love, you know. And already that happened in Border, and it kind of continued. And in Elixir, the third book, I was also once again coming across experiences of extreme suffering, and individual and collective, even though it wasn't a border region in the same way. I guess I'm interested in suffering, suffering and healing, and that's what that book explores. The alchemical process, you know, of working with pain.
And lots of your protagonists find a solution for themselves in their very own story.
I don't know if solutions is the way, but yes, they find ways. They find ways, like water always finds a way. You know, water of all the elements, water is the strongest and the quietest, and the most healing. So we have to look for a way, you know, be like water. I mentioned this because Elixir explores the 4 elements, and we are all made up of those elements, like the earth, because each of us is a microcosm of the earth, you know, our great Gaia. Yes, I hope that despite the fact that border really takes place in the underworld, there are many kind of golden truths and ways that people find through the darkness. And if one person does it, it affects the collective, you know. This is the kind of hidden power of marginal people and places that I am so drawn to. Real power, the power of the humble individual who has no other power, is great, and I want to keep exploring that in my work, you know, the quiet power versus the power of violence, you know, patriarchal power.
I have a very dedicated audience here with me. Everybody was listening very, very carefully. Maybe we have a question as well from your side. Če je morda kakšno vprašanje, zdaj imamo res še lepo priložnost, da podaljšamo to razmišljanje avtorice o mejah. Bomo veseli še kakšnega vašega, da vas vidim malo bolje. If not, Kapka, thank you so much for sharing your stories. And I just wanted to ask you at the end, because you have been researching now so many stories and the history of the landscape, the places of your childhood. Is it tempting maybe to start writing in the Bulgarian language? Because you're writing in English, right? You've been writing in English ever since.
Yeah. I left Bulgaria 30 years ago, and English became my primary literary language. But I do rewrite my books into Bulgarian, and I think it's environmental. We are creatures of our environment, and I write in English for as long as I will live in English. But all these books, you know, it's a quartet actually. It's 4 books. They were all, of course, the primary language was either Bulgarian or another, or Macedonian or another Slavic language. You know, the Slavic kind of the portal of Slavic, you know, language made these books what they are. I couldn't have written them without that. And with each book, the sound of the language became more and more important because of regional variations. And so I have this kind of complex process of writing my books twice.
It's very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on your books, and we are really looking forward that Beletrina maybe will translate more of your works. So take care. Hope to see you once in person on this festival. Yes, so
We will.
All the best and regards to Scotland.
Thank you.
Bye, lahko noč. Hvala lepa.
Hvala.
Tako, drage bralke in bralci, hvala tudi vam res za natančno poslušanje, ker čutila se je, kako napeto je. Mislim, da je avtorica zanimiva tudi za naše območje, čeprav smo odraščali v Jugoslaviji, vidim več ali manj mojo generacijo, plus minus. So zagotovo neke stvari, ki so nam tudi blizu in jih najdemo v tej knjigi. Tule ima Beletrina seveda lep izbor tudi z letošnjega festivala. Med ponudbo boste tudi našli knjigo Meja avtorice Kapke Kassabove. Hvala lepa, da ste prišli. Hvala.